before cities rose from stone, before kings wore crowns, before writing scratched its first symbols into clay, there was hunger. Not the hunger of skipping one meal, not the hunger of wanting a snack. This was the deep, ancient hunger that shaped every decision of early human life. It lived in empty stomachs through cold nights. It followed families across dry plains. It pushed people to search, gather, hunt, and survive one more day. In that distant world, bread did not exist. There were no bakeries glowing in the morning light. No warm loaves wrapped in cloth. No scent of crust drifting through village streets. The idea of slicing into soft bread would have seemed like magic. But the story of bread begins long before bread itself. It begins with seeds. Imagine the earth 10,000 years ago. The last ice age was fading. Great sheets of frozen land were retreating. Rivers changed their paths. Forests spread into new places. Grasslands rolled across valleys under wide skies. Herds of wild animals moved with the seasons. And among the grasses, hidden in plain sight, grew something small and easily ignored. Wild wheat, wild barley, tiny grains swaying in the wind. To us, they look ordinary. To the people of that age, they were opportunity. Early humans were hunters and gatherers. They followed animals, picked berries, dug roots, collected nuts, and searched for anything edible. Life was uncertain. Some days brought success. Others brought almost nothing. So people learned to notice every useful plant around them. At some point, someone bent down and gathered grass seeds by hand. No one knows their name. No record remains. But somewhere, perhaps in the lands we now call the Fertile Crescent, stretching through parts of modern-day Iraq, Arabic Sin, Arabic Wow, Arabic Rat, Arabic Yet, Arabic Halif, Turkey, and surrounding regions, people began collecting wild grains in large amounts. It was slow work. Each stalk held only a little food. Seeds had to be plucked, shaken loose, or beaten into baskets. The sun was hot. Hands became rough. Dust filled the air. But grains had one powerful advantage. They could be stored. Meat spoiled. Fruit rotted. Leaves wilted. But dried seeds could wait. That changed everything. For the first time, people could gather food now and eat later. A sack of grain meant safety. It meant survival through winter. It meant one less desperate journey. Still, raw grain was not pleasant. Hard seeds could crack teeth. They were tough, dry, and difficult to digest. So the next great step was not farming. It was processing. Picture a small camp at dusk. Firelight flickers against stone. Children sleep nearby. A few adults sit together with gathered seeds spread before them. They rub the grains between stones, removing husks. They crush them, grind them, pound them into coarse meal. This may have been one of humanity's earliest kitchen sounds. Stone against stone. Rhythmic, patient, transforming something nearly inedible into something useful. Archaeologists have found ancient grinding stones worn smooth by repeated use, some dating back many thousands of years. These stones tell a quiet story. They show that grain was not just occasionally eaten. It had become important enough to process again and again. Once crushed into meal, grain became easier to use. People could mix it with water into porridge. They could boil it. They could make a paste. It filled the stomach. It gave energy. It lasted longer than many gathered foods. And hidden inside this simple mixture was the beginning of bread. No trumpets announced it. No one knew they stood at the edge of a revolution. Perhaps one day, some thick grain paste spilled onto a hot stone near the fire. Perhaps someone intentionally spread it there. Perhaps a child played with leftovers and flattened it onto warm rock. The paste dried. The heat cooked it. The surface changed color. Steam rose. When lifted from the stone, it had become something new. A flat cake, firm outside, softer inside, easier to carry than porridge, easier to share, easier to eat while traveling. Primitive bread. It would not have looked like modern bread. No golden sandwich loaf, no fluffy interior, no crusty artisan round. It was rough, dense, and simple. But in that moment, food became more than gathered nature. It became crafted nourishment. That difference matters. Cooking changes the relationship between humans and the world. Fire already allowed meat to soften and roots to sweeten, but bread-like food meant humans were now redesigning plants themselves through labor, tools, heat, and imagination. The grain was no longer just grain. It had become possibility. Over time, people improved the method. They learned finer grinding made smoother cakes. Different grains created different textures. More heat made a crisp surface. Less heat made softer centers. Thin cakes cooked quickly. Thick ones stayed moist longer. These were not written recipes. They were remembered skills, passed from elder to child, watched, copied, adjusted. 1,000 small experiments across generations. And slowly, the making of bread entered daily life. Morning, gather fuel, grind grain, fetch water. Midday, shape cakes, cook on hot stones. Evening, eat together. Such routines may sound ordinary, but they helped build civilization. Repeated tasks create structure. Structure creates settlement. Settlement creates community. Because grain could be stored, people no longer needed to move constantly. Because it could be processed into filling food, staying in one place became more practical. Because meals could feed many people, larger groups could survive together. Bread did not create villages alone, but it helped. Now imagine the emotional power of this food. After a difficult hunt with no success, there was still grain. After storms damaged wild fruit, there was still grain. When elders could no longer chase animals, could still grind grain and contribute. Bread, even in its earliest form, brought reliability into an unreliable world. And reliability is precious. Yet another mystery was waiting. Somewhere in a forgotten camp, dough was left sitting too long. Maybe rain delayed the meal. Maybe someone became ill. Maybe the paste rested near warmth through the night. In the air, invisible wild yeast drifted all around, settling onto surfaces, feeding on sugars inside the grain mixture. By morning, the dough had changed. It bubbled. It smelled different. It had life inside it. To early people, this must have seemed strange, perhaps even alarming. Food moving on its own, dough rising without hands touching it. What happened next would take bread into an entirely new age. But not yet. For now, the first chapter belongs to patient hands, gathering seeds under open skies, to stones grinding meal beside ancient fires, and to the first rough cakes lifted from hot rock, while smoke curled into the dark. No kings recorded it. No monuments marked it. Yet this quiet invention would outlast empires. Because once humans learned to turn grass seeds into bread, history itself began to rise. And in the next part, the wild grains of the earth would lead people toward fields, farms, and the first great settlements of the ancient world. The first breads were born in camps of hunters and gatherers, made beside open fires with rough hands and simple stones. But once people discovered that grain could be stored, ground, cooked, and trusted, life began to change in ways no one could fully see. A seed is a small thing. You can hold several in one palm. You can lose them in the dust. A bird can swallow them without notice. Yet inside each seed is a force that can reshape the world. At some point, perhaps by accident, people noticed something important. Seeds dropped near camp returned as plants. Where grain had been cleaned, scattered, or discarded, green shoots appeared when the rains came. What was once gathered from distant hillsides could now grow close to where people slept. This may have happened many times in many places. There was no single dramatic moment when humanity suddenly shouted, "We have invented farming." Instead, there were seasons of observation, years of small experiments, generations slowly learning the rhythm of the earth. If seeds were placed in soft soil, more plants might grow. If weeds were cleared, grain grew stronger. If ripe stalks were cut at the right time, harvests improved. If the best seeds were saved and planted again, future crops became better. These lessons were learned without books, without laboratories, without written science. They were learned through weathered hands, tired backs, sharp eyes, and memory. And so the ancient relationship between humans and grain deepened. No longer were people only gatherers of wild food. They became caretakers of fields. Imagine a valley in the early morning thousands of years ago. Mist clings to the ground. A river bends through reeds and mud. Beyond it, low houses of clay and wood stand close together. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Dogs bark. Children run barefoot through packed earth. Nearby, men and women move through patches of planted grain. They bend, weed, watch the sky, check the soil, repair simple fences, scare away birds. Their lives are now tied to seasons in a new way. If rains fail, everyone suffers. If harvest succeeds, everyone eats. This was the bargain of agriculture. More food, but more risk. More stability, but more labor. More people, but more dependence on land. Still, the rewards were powerful. Farming could feed larger groups than hunting and gathering alone. Families grew. Villages expanded. Permanent homes replaced temporary camps. Storage pits filled with grain became treasure more valuable than ornaments. And with more grain came more bread. Now bread was no longer just a survival food made from chance collections of wild seeds. It became a daily foundation, a center of the meal, something expected, but making it was still hard. There were no metal mills, no packaged flour, no machines humming in clean rooms. Every handful of meal came from grinding by hand. People knelt over stones for hours, crushing kernels into flour. The motion repeated again and again. Push, roll, crush, lift, repeat. Archaeologists studying ancient skeletons have found signs of this labor in bones and joints. Bodies remember work long after names are forgotten. Worn knees, strained shoulders, damaged teeth from stone grit and flour, all whisper the same truth. Bread was precious because bread was earned. The flour itself was coarse. Tiny fragments of husk remained mixed in. Sand or grit sometimes entered from grinding stones. Yet once water touched the meal, something familiar happened. Dough formed. It could be pressed, shaped, flattened, cooked. In many early villages, flatbreads were likely common. They cooked quickly on hot stones, clay surfaces, or in ashes near the fire. Some may have been thick and hearty, others thin and crisp, some plain, some mixed with herbs, seeds, or pulses. Even in this early age, bread was already becoming many things. Food adapts wherever people live. Near rivers, bread might be softer from easier access to water. In dry lands, harder breads may have stored longer. Where barley grew better than wheat, flavor changed. Where fuel was scarce, thinner breads that cooked fast made sense. One invention, endless local versions. And while bread fed stomachs, it also began to shape society. Think about what farming requires. Fields must be planted at the right time. Harvests must be gathered quickly. Grain must be stored safely. Tools must be made. Water managed. Land protected. Knowledge shared. This creates cooperation. People who once moved in small bands now needed organized communities. Someone repaired walls. Someone guarded grain stores. Someone specialized in pottery for storage jars. Someone made better blades for cutting stalks. Someone spent more time grinding and baking. From bread came division of labor. From division of labor came complexity. From complexity came the first roots of civilization. In places like Jericho, Saddlehuruk, and other early settlements, human life was becoming denser, louder, more connected. Homes stood wall to wall. Smoke darkened ceilings. Animals were kept nearby. Grain stores filled rooms. Daily routines revolved around planting, harvesting, grinding, baking, eating. And always, behind much of it, was bread. But bread was more than calories. It carried emotion. Imagine the comfort of warm flatbread handed to a child on a cold morning. Imagine travelers sharing dried bread on a dusty road. Imagine neighbors bringing bread to a grieving family. Imagine the relief of seeing grain bins still full after a harsh winter. Food becomes culture long before it becomes cuisine. Bread likely entered rituals too. Harvest celebrations, offerings to ancestors, shared meals marking births, marriages, alliances. When something feeds a people every day, it becomes sacred in ways both formal and quiet. Yet life was not romantic. Agriculture also brought hardship. Crop failure could mean famine. Stored grain attracted pests. Villages could be raided. Repetitive labor exhausted bodies. Diets sometimes narrowed. Dependence on one crop made communities vulnerable. And still they planted, because bread, even imperfect bread, gave something rare in the ancient world: predictability. A hunter may return empty-handed. Trees may bear little fruit, but a managed field, if fortune held, promised a future. That promise was enough to keep generations sowing seeds into uncertain soil. Then another transformation began. As grain farming spread, people selected plants with better traits. Seeds that stayed on the stalk longer. Kernels that were larger. Plants easier to harvest. Year after year, human choices changed wheat and barley themselves. The plants were evolving beside us. Wild grasses became domestic crops. Nature and humanity were now partners, though neither could speak of it. And as villages grew into towns, new tools appeared. Better storage jars, larger ovens, improved grinding stones, more refined flour. Bread moved from rough necessity towards skilled craft. Some bakers, though they would not yet call themselves, that must have gained reputations. Certain households made softer bread, better shaped loaves, more flavorful cakes. Techniques became valued knowledge. The simple act of mixing grain and water was slowly becoming an art. Yet one mystery still lingered in kitchens and courtyards: the strange swelling of dough left to rest. Why did some dough puff and lighten? Why did cooked bread sometimes become softer, fuller, more fragrant. No microscope existed to reveal yeast. No chemistry explained fermentation. There was only experience, wonder, and repeated success. Somewhere ahead, in the lands of great rivers and rising cities, people would learn to harness that invisible magic more deliberately than ever before. And when they did, bread would rise with empires. The rivers changed everything. Across dry lands, where rain could fail and fields could wither, two kinds of water brought life with dependable rhythm. In the land of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates flowed through wide plains. In Egypt, the Nile rose and fell with ancient certainty. Along their banks, mud turned fertile, crops flourished, and villages swelled into cities. Here, bread would leave the small hearth of the village and enter the machinery of civilization. Imagine dawn over an early city. The air is cool for only a short while. Reed boats glide through canals. Donkeys shuffle through narrow streets, carrying baskets. Smoke begins to rise from rooftops. Merchants open stalls. Laborers gather tools. Priests prepare temples. Scribes unroll clay tablets or smooth fresh surfaces for writing. And in homes, courtyards, and workshops across the city, grain is being ground. The sound is everywhere. Stone scraping stone. A city waking to bread. These societies depended heavily on grain. Wheat and barley could be grown in large amounts, stored in granaries, taxed, traded, and distributed. Grain was not only food, it was wealth. It was political power. It was security against famine. It was a measure of order itself. If the harvest was strong, rulers appeared wise. If grain stores failed, fear spread quickly. Bread now stood at the center of systems far larger than family survival. In Mesopotamia, some of the earliest written records mention grain, flour, rations, and food distribution. Clay tablets tracked what entered storage and what left it. Workers might be paid partly in grain. Temple institutions managed supplies. Administrators counted sacks and monitored labor. This may seem distant and bureaucratic, but it reveals something profound. Bread had become important enough to write about. For thousands of years, humans lived, loved, struggled, and died without written history. Yet, once writing emerged, grain and bread were among the first daily realities worthy of record. That tells us what mattered. Now, imagine an Egyptian village during flood season. The Nile has spilled over its banks, leaving rich black silt behind. Farmers sow seeds into moist earth. Months later, fields shimmer gold beneath the sun. Harvesters cut stalks with sickles. Bundles are stacked high. Grain is carried to storehouses guarded carefully. Some of it will become bread, a great deal of it. In ancient Egypt, bread was one of the most important foods in everyday life. Rich or poor, many people ate it regularly. It came in different shapes, textures, and qualities. Some loaves were coarse and dark, others finer and lighter. Some were simple, some flavored with dates, honey, herbs, or oils. Already, bread was becoming diverse, but Egypt may also have helped transform bread in another way: mastery of leavening. No one can say exactly where risen bread was first consistently made. Fermentation likely happened naturally in many places. But Egypt's warm climate, abundant grain culture, and developed baking traditions created ideal conditions for experimenting with dough. Picture a bowl of wet dough left in the shade. Wild yeast in the air settles into it. Microorganisms begin feeding. Tiny bubbles form. The mass expands. It becomes lighter, alive with trapped gas no eye can truly understand. A baker notices. The risen dough bakes differently. It is softer, fuller, easier to chew, more fragrant. So the baker saves a piece of old dough and mixes it into the next batch. Then again and again. Without naming it, they are maintaining a starter. One of the oldest culinary partnerships in history had begun. Humans and yeast working together. Think of the wonder of that moment. Grain from the earth, water from the river, fire from fuel, invisible life from the air, combined by skilled hands into bread that swells and transforms. It must have felt almost sacred, and in many ways it was. Egyptian tomb paintings and archaeological finds show scenes of baking, brewing, kneading, and grain preparation. Bread and beer were closely linked because both depended on grain and fermentation. In some reconstructions, partially baked bread may even have been crumbled into brewing mixtures. Kitchens and breweries shared ingredients, labor, and knowledge. This was a grain civilization. From peasant homes to royal estates, the cycle repeated endlessly. Grow, harvest, thresh, grind, knead, bake, eat. Yet the process remained physically demanding. Grain was pounded and milled by hand. Dough was mixed in large bowls or troughs. Ovens had to be heated with wood, straw, or dung fuel. Heat was hard to control. Some loaves burned, others stayed undercooked. Dust filled the workspace. Bodies tired quickly. Still, skill mattered. An experienced baker could judge dough by touch, moisture by feel, heat by instinct, timing by scent and color. These senses became a kind of unwritten science. Bread was no longer just made. It was crafted, and with craft came status. Specialized bakers likely served temples, palaces, and large households. Feeding laborers on state projects required planning and mass production. Workers building monuments, digging canals, or serving institutions needed daily rations. Bread became fuel for civilization's greatest ambitions. When we picture pyramids or city walls, we often think of stone blocks and engineering. But behind every worker stood a simpler necessity: food. Armies march on grain. builders lived on bread. Even religion absorbed its meaning. Offerings of bread were placed in tombs and temples. The dead were imagined needing sustenance in the next world. Gods received loaves as gifts. To offer bread was to offer life itself. There is something moving in that idea. A food once improvised on hot stones by small wandering groups had become worthy of kings and gods. But bread also carried inequality. The wealthy could access finer flour, softer loaves, sweeter additions. The poor often ate coarser bread with more grit and bran. Some ancient teeth were worn badly, partly from stone particles mixed into flour during grinding. Even daily bread reflected class. Civilization creates abundance, but not always equally. Yet across those divisions, bread remained a shared language. Rich and poor both knew its smell. Both understood the relief of a full storehouse and the fear of an empty one. As centuries passed, baking methods improved. Ovens evolved beyond simple hearthstones. Enclosed clay ovens held heat better. Larger batches became possible. Shapes varied for function, status, or ritual meaning. Bread could travel, be traded, be stored, be rationed. And with trade came movement. Ideas moved with merchants. Seeds traveled with migrants. Techniques crossed borders. A baker in one land might never meet another far away. Yet their methods slowly influenced each other through the long pathways of exchange. The story of bread was no longer local. It was becoming global. Soon, new empires would rise around the Mediterranean. Sailors, soldiers, traders, and settlers would carry grain and baking traditions across seas. In crowded markets and growing republics, bread would become a political force, a public expectation, and at times, a dangerous demand. Because once cities depend on bread, the people notice when it is missing. And in the next part, bread will enter the world of Greece and Rome, where loaves fed armies, shaped economies, and helped hold empires together. By the time the great civilizations of the Mediterranean began to rise, bread was no longer a fragile experiment of early villages. It was no longer a rough mixture of crushed grain and water cooked on hot stone. It had become something far greater. Bread had become civilization's daily heartbeat. Across the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, new cultures were emerging. Trade routes stretched like invisible threads between islands, coasts, and continents. Ships carried oil, wine, pottery, and always grain. Because wherever people gathered in large numbers, bread had to follow. In ancient Greece, bread became a central part of everyday life. It was not just food, it was structure. Morning meals often included bread dipped in wine or oil. Simple flatbreads were common among poorer households, while wealthier families could enjoy finer loaves made from better flour. But what made Greek bread culture important was not just how it was eaten. It was how it was understood. The Greeks began to think more deeply about the world around them. Philosophy, science, and observation grew alongside daily life. Even something as ordinary as bread would have been part of this changing intellectual world. Imagine a small Greek household at sunrise. The air is cool, the sea breeze drifting through open shutters. A woman kneads dough in a wooden bowl. Her hands move rhythmically, pressing, folding, turning. A child watches, learning without words. Outside, the sound of footsteps and distant market voices begins to rise. The dough rests, and slowly it changes. It swells slightly in the warmth of the room, alive in ways people do not fully understand. They know only that time matters, that waiting improves the bread, that yesterday's dough can help today's dough rise better. Experience becomes knowledge. Knowledge becomes tradition. And tradition becomes culture. In Greek cities like Athens, bread was sold in markets alongside olives, fish, and cheese. Bakers worked in small shops with ovens built from clay or stone. The smell of baking bread drifted into narrow streets, mixing with smoke, sea air, and human life. Bread was becoming urban, but the real transformation came with Rome. If Greece gave bread culture reflection and variety, Rome gave it scale. The Roman Republic, and later the Roman Empire, depended on grain like no previous civilization before it. As Rome expanded, it controlled vast agricultural regions across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. These lands fed the growing population of the capital city, and in Rome itself, bread became a political necessity. Imagine the city at its peak. Millions of people crowding into dense neighborhoods, markets overflowing with goods from across the empire, marble buildings rising under the sun, roads stretching in perfect lines outward from the city like veins of power. And in every district, one thing mattered deeply: the grain supply. Rome understood a simple truth: hungry citizens are unstable citizens. So grain was imported on massive scales, especially from Egypt and North Africa. Ships crossed the sea loaded with wheat. Granaries stored it. Officials managed distribution. The state became deeply involved in ensuring bread reached the population. Over time, this system became known through the idea of free or subsidized grain distribution for citizens. Bread was no longer just a household craft. It was public policy. Now imagine Roman bakers at work. Large ovens glow with steady heat. Workers shape dough into round loaves. Some are stamped with markings indicating bakeries or ownership. Others are plain and functional. The process is organized, repetitive, and efficient. This is bread as industry. The Roman bakeries were far more advanced than earlier kitchens. They used mills powered by animals, or even water in some regions. Grain could be ground faster and in larger quantities. Dough could be prepared in bulk. Baking became more standardized, and with standardization came consistency. A Roman citizen could expect a certain type of bread, made in a recognizable way, available in markets across the empire. This consistency helped bind the empire together. Wherever a Roman traveled from Britain to Egypt, they could find familiar foods. Bread became a symbol of Roman order, but behind this order was enormous labor. Fields in conquered lands were cultivated not just for local survival, but for imperial supply. Farmers worked under taxes and demands. Grain was collected, transported, stored, and redistributed through complex systems. Bread was no longer just a product of soil and fire. It was part of empire itself, and in Rome, bread also became social identity. Public bakeries fed urban populations. Soldiers on campaign relied on rations of grain that could be ground and baked wherever they marched. Slaves and laborers depended on basic loaves for survival. Wealthy citizens enjoyed finer varieties, sometimes enriched with eggs, milk, or honey. Bread reflected Rome's hierarchy, yet even emperors understood its importance. There is a famous idea, often summarized as bread and games. A phrase describing how public food distribution and entertainment helped maintain social stability in Rome. Whether or not every detail is historically precise, the concept captures something true. Bread was power. A city fed is a city controlled. But Rome's relationship with bread was not only political, it was also technological. Watermills began to spread in some parts of the empire. These machines used flowing rivers to turn large grinding stones, dramatically increasing flour production. This reduced human labor and allowed for larger-scale baking than ever before. It was an early step toward mechanization. Still, most bread was made by human hands. The smell of baking remained tied to human effort, sweat, and skill. Bakers were essential workers. Their knowledge mattered. Their ovens shaped daily life. And in Roman homes, bread remained deeply personal. Families still needed dough. Children still learned by watching. Meals still centered around loaves shared at tables. Even as empires grew vast, bread kept its intimate place in daily life. There is something powerful in that contrast. The same food that fed emperors and armies also fed small families in quiet homes. The same grain that crossed oceans also passed through simple hands. But even Rome could not escape uncertainty. A failed harvest in distant provinces, a disrupted trade route, or political instability could threaten the grain supply. When bread became dependent on empire-scale systems, its absence became a threat not just to individuals, but to entire cities. And cities remember hunger. They do not forget it easily. As centuries moved forward, the Western Roman Empire eventually weakened. Trade routes changed. Political control fractured. Systems of grain distribution collapsed in some regions. Cities shrank. Populations shifted back toward rural life. And with that shift, bread returned closer to its older roots. Smaller communities, local ovens, family production. Less standardization, more variation. Knowledge preserved in monasteries, households, and surviving towns. It was not the end of bread. It was a transformation again. Because bread always adapts to human life. When empires rise, bread becomes industrial. When empires fall, bread becomes local again. When people move, bread moves with them. And somewhere in the quiet centuries ahead, new hands would continue to knead dough in cold kitchens, preserving ancient techniques while slowly shaping new ones. In the next part, bread will enter the medieval world monasteries, castles, villages, and trade routes, where it will once again evolve under changing skies, carrying the memory of empires within every crust. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the world did not suddenly become dark or empty. Life continued, but it changed shape. Cities shrank. Trade slowed in some regions. Roads that once carried imperial grain became quieter. The great systems that had once moved bread across continents weakened. And in that space, bread returned closer to the soil, closer to villages, closer to individual hands again. This was the beginning of the medieval world. Imagine a small European village at dawn. Mist rises from damp fields. Wooden houses sit scattered near a church and a mill. Chickens move through dirt paths. Smoke curls from chimneys. Somewhere, a bell rings softly, marking the rhythm of the day. Inside a home, a family prepares bread. There is no large bakery, no imperial supply chain, no standardized loaf, only grain stored in sacks or wooden bins, carefully saved from the last harvest. A woman pours kernels into a hand mill, turning heavy stone against stone. The grinding is slow, almost meditative, but also exhausting. Push, turn, grind. The sound is steady, like breathing. Flour collects in a bowl coarse, uneven, still carrying traces of husk. Water is added. A bit of salt, if available. Sometimes old dough from yesterday is mixed in to help the bread rise. In many villages, knowledge of fermentation survives quietly, passed through generations without formal explanation. Dough is kneaded on wooden tables or simple cloth-covered surfaces. Children watch. Elders guide. The kitchen becomes a place of learning without books. Bread here is not just food. It is survival stored in grain. Across medieval Europe, bread was the most important part of the diet for most people. Meat was rare for many. Vegetables changed with the seasons. But bread, if the harvest was good, could be eaten every day. White bread made from fine wheat flour was rare and expensive, often reserved for the wealthy or for special occasions. Most common people ate darker bread made from rye, barley, or mixed grains. It was heavier, denser, sometimes rough on the teeth, but it filled the stomach. Bread defined class in a very visible way. Even the color of your loaf could tell your place in society. But bread was not only made in homes, it was also made in shared spaces. One of the most important features of medieval villages was the communal oven. Building a large oven required resources, skill, and fuel. So instead of each family having their own, many villages shared a single baking oven. The oven was heated for hours using wood. Once it reached the right temperature, families would bring their prepared dough to be baked. The baker or oven keeper would manage the process, loading loaves in and out with long wooden tools. This created a rhythm of community life. Baking days became social events. People gathered, exchanged news, shared stories while waiting for their bread. The smell of baking loaves filled the village air, mixing with smoke and earth. Bread was not just consumed together, it was made together. Meanwhile, a different kind of bread-making culture was growing inside monasteries. Monks across Europe lived lives of prayer, study, and labor. Many monasteries became centers of agricultural knowledge. They cultivated land, stored grain, and maintained baking traditions with careful discipline. Inside monastery kitchens, bread was often made with precision. Recipes were recorded, improved, and preserved. Monks valued consistency. Bread was not only nourishment for the body, but also part of a structured spiritual life. The rhythm of kneading and baking matched the rhythm of prayer and meditation. In these quiet places, some of the knowledge of ancient baking survived the turbulence of collapsing empires. But medieval bread was also deeply tied to risk. Harvests determined everything. A good season meant full granaries and stable meals. A bad season meant scarcity, hunger, and fear. Weather was unpredictable. Droughts, floods, and cold spells could destroy crops. Without modern storage systems or transportation networks, local failures could become serious crises. Entire communities depended on what the fields produced each year. Bread was stability, but also vulnerability. In times of scarcity, bread itself became thinner, darker, sometimes mixed with other ingredients to stretch supply. People might add oats, peas, or even ground bark or roots during severe shortages. These were desperate measures, but they reveal how central bread was. Even when food ran low, bread was still the foundation that people tried to preserve, because without bread, there was nothing to replace it. Across medieval towns, guilds of bakers began to emerge. As cities slowly grew again, baking became a respected trade. Bakers learned specific techniques, controlled oven temperatures, managed fermentation times, and supplied markets and households. Bread started to become regulated. Authorities often monitored bread quality and weight because it was so important to public life. In some places, rules were enforced to ensure fairness so that buyers received enough bread for their money. Bread was no longer just tradition. It was governance. At the same time, trade slowly revived. Grain moved along rivers and roads again. Mills became more advanced. Watermills and windmills appeared in different regions, automating the grinding process and reducing the massive human labor once required to make flour. The sound of milling shifted from human hands to the turning of wooden blades and flowing water. This was another quiet revolution. Flour could now be produced more efficiently. More bread could be made. Populations slowly increased again. Towns expanded. And with expansion came variety. Different regions developed different breads based on available grains and local tastes. Rye breads became common in colder northern regions. Wheat remained dominant in fertile southern lands. Flatbreads persisted in some areas, while leavened loaves became standard in others. Bread reflected geography. Bread reflected climate. Bread reflected culture. But even as techniques improved, the basic experience of bread remained familiar. The warmth of a freshly baked loaf, the breaking of crust, the shared meal. In castles, bread appeared on the tables of nobility, often refined, soft, and accompanied by meats and rich foods. In peasant homes, it remained simple, filling, and essential. But in both places, it carried meaning. Bread was life made visible, and yet something important was happening quietly beneath all of this. Knowledge of fermentation, milling, baking, and grain selection was slowly accumulating across centuries. People did not understand yeast as a microorganism. They did not know chemistry in modern terms, but they understood behavior, timing, and transformation. They knew that dough changes when left alone. They knew that heat transforms raw mixture into solid food. They knew that grain, when processed correctly, could sustain entire populations. This accumulated wisdom was the foundation for everything that would come next. Because in the late medieval period, something new was beginning to stir in Europe. Trade routes were expanding beyond old boundaries. Cities were growing larger. Exploration was beginning to push beyond familiar maps. New ingredients, new ideas, and new technologies were slowly entering the world of food. Bread was about to enter another transformation, not through empires or monasteries this time, but through global exchange. And in the next part, bread will step into the age of exploration, where continents connect, ingredients travel across oceans, and the simple act of baking begins to change on a worldwide scale. The world was beginning to widen. For centuries, bread had lived mostly within familiar borders, villages, kingdoms, monasteries, and nearby trade routes. But now, something different was happening. Ships were no longer only hugging coastlines. Maps were being redrawn. Horizons were no longer limits, but invitations. This was the age when continents began to speak to each other, and bread, quietly and faithfully, would travel with them. Imagine a wooden ship creaking under the weight of the sea. The sails are full, the air salty and sharp. Inside the hull, barrels of grain are stacked carefully. Some are sealed tightly to prevent moisture. Others are marked for trade, taxation, or survival. Because no matter how far humans sailed, one truth followed them everywhere. They needed bread. Life at sea was harsh. Food had to last for weeks or months. Fresh meat spoiled quickly. Fruit rotted. Water turned stale. But grain, dry, simple, patient, could endure the journey. It was the perfect companion for exploration. Sailors carried hard biscuits made from flour and water, baked twice to remove moisture. These were not soft or pleasant like fresh bread. They were dense, rigid, sometimes so hard they had to be soaked in water or soup before eating. But they were survival. Crack. That sound of biting into a ship's biscuit was the sound of distance, endurance, and necessity. Meanwhile, on land, the world was changing in ways that would reshape bread forever. The late medieval period was transitioning into the age of exploration. European powers began sailing farther than ever before, driven by trade, curiosity, competition, and ambition. New sea routes were discovered. New lands appeared on maps, and with those lands came new crops: corn, potatoes, tomatoes, cocoa, sugar in greater abundance. These were not yet fully understood in European kitchens, but they would eventually change global food culture. At first, they were curiosities, then trade goods, then essential parts of diets. But bread ancient, familiar bread would adapt and remain at the center. Imagine a port city during this time. It is loud, crowded, alive. Merchants shout in different languages. Sailors unload cargo. Spice scents fill the air. Grain is weighed, exchanged, stored. Bakers work nearby ovens, preparing loaves for workers, travelers, and households. Bread is everywhere, as always, but now it is part of a global network. Wheat grown in one region might be milled in another. Flour might travel by ship. Baking techniques might spread between cultures. Even the idea of bread itself begins to shift as ingredients and methods mix across continents. In the Americas, indigenous peoples had already developed their own grain-based foods long before European arrival. Corn-based flatbreads, tortillas, and other traditional foods formed the foundation of many cultures. When Europeans arrived, these food systems began to interact, sometimes blending, sometimes clashing. Bread was no longer one single tradition. It was becoming many traditions meeting each other. In Europe, wheat bread remained dominant, but new ingredients slowly entered kitchens. Cornmeal began to appear in some regions. Potatoes, once accepted, would later influence flour production indirectly by changing agricultural patterns. Sugar and spices from distant lands added sweetness and complexity to baked goods that had once been simple and plain. Bread was becoming global, but this global expansion also brought inequality on a larger scale. Colonial systems changed agriculture dramatically. Large plantations were established in various parts of the world. Grain production, labor systems, and trade routes were reorganized to serve distant markets. Bread in some regions became dependent not only on local harvests, but on global economic forces. For many people, bread remained a daily necessity, but its production was now tied to vast systems of power. At the same time, technological progress was quietly transforming how bread was made. The invention and spread of improved milling systems meant flour could be produced more efficiently and more finely than ever before. Watermills and windmills became widespread across Europe. Later, more advanced industrial milling techniques would begin to appear. This meant smoother flour, whiter bread, more consistent texture. Bread was moving towards standardization again, but on a much larger, more powerful scale than in ancient Rome. In cities, bakeries became more organized. Baking shifted from household necessity to specialized profession in many areas. Bakers worked long hours in warm, flour-dusted environments. Dough was prepared in bulk. Ovens were fired daily. Bread was sold in markets or directly from shops. The smell of baking became a permanent part of urban life. And still, beneath all this change, the basic process remained ancient. Grain, water, heat, time, sometimes yeast, sometimes patience, always transformation. But something important was beginning to emerge in human understanding. For thousands of years, bread had been made through experience alone. Bakers knew what worked, but not always why it worked. Fermentation was mysterious. Rising dough felt alive, but its cause was invisible. Now, slowly, science was beginning to enter the kitchen. During the early modern period, curiosity about nature increased. Scientists began studying air, heat, fermentation, and chemistry. They started to question what was happening inside dough, why it rose, why it changed texture, why heat transformed it so dramatically. The invisible world was beginning to be explored, but even before full scientific explanation arrived, bakers already knew something powerful. Small changes in process created big changes in bread. More kneading meant stronger dough. Longer resting improved texture. Different grains produced different results. Temperature mattered. Time mattered. Everything mattered. was becoming a bridge between ancient tradition and modern science. In homes, however, bread still held its emotional place. A mother still broke bread for her children at the table. A traveler still carried dried bread for long journeys. A worker still depended on bread after exhausting labor. A community still gathered around shared meals, because no matter how global the world became, bread remained personal. It remained intimate. And as exploration continued, ships kept crossing oceans, carrying grain, flour, and baking knowledge into new territories. Cities grew larger. Trade networks expanded. Cultures blended in complex ways. Bread was now part of a global story, not just a local one. But this expansion also set the stage for another transformation, one even more dramatic, because soon machines would begin to enter the world of bread. And when they did, the ancient rhythm of hand grinding, hand kneading, and wood-fired baking would begin to change forever. In the next part, bread will enter the early industrial age, where mills, factories, and new technologies begin reshaping how humanity feeds itself, turning ancient craft into large-scale production. The world was changing faster now. For thousands of years, bread had been shaped by human hands, stone mills, wooden ovens, and the slow rhythm of seasons. Even as empires rose and fell, even as ships crossed oceans and continents connected, the core process remained almost the same. Grain was ground, dough was kneaded, bread was baked. But now, something new was entering the story. Machines. At first, they were not the loud, roaring machines we imagine from factories. They were simpler, quieter, often powered by nature itself, water flowing through rivers, wind turning large wooden blades. These forces, constant and tireless, began to replace human labor in one of the most exhausting parts of bread making: grinding grain. Imagine standing near a river in early industrial Europe. The sound of rushing water is strong, steady. A wooden wheel turns slowly, its paddles dipping into the current again and again. Inside a nearby structure, heavy stones rotate, crushing grain into flour. No hands are turning the mill. No backs are bent over grinding stones. The river is doing the work. This was the watermill, one of the most important technological shifts in bread history. For the first time, flour could be produced in larger quantities with far less human effort. Villages that once depended on manual grinding could now process grain faster. Towns could support more bakers. Bread production could increase, and with it, populations could grow. But watermills were only the beginning. Windmills soon appeared in regions where rivers were less reliable. Tall wooden structures stood on hills and open plains, their sails spinning in the wind like giant arms reaching into the sky. These machines turned grinding stones inside their frames, silently producing flour even in remote areas. The landscape itself became part of bread production. Wind, water, human need, all connected through technology. But even as milling improved, baking itself still relied heavily on human skill. Dough still had to be prepared by hand. Ovens still required careful heat control. Bakers still judged timing through experience. Bread was in a strange in-between stage, part ancient craft, part emerging industry. Then came a much larger transformation: the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines began to replace natural power in many industries. Factories expanded. Cities grew rapidly. People moved from rural villages into crowded urban centers in search of work. Life changed in speed, scale, and structure. And bread had to change with it. In growing cities like London, Paris, and others across Europe, demand for bread exploded. Thousands of workers needed food every day. Small local bakeries could no longer keep up alone. Production had to increase dramatically. This led to the rise of large-scale bakeries. Imagine a vast industrial bakery filled with heat and noise. Long tables stretch across rooms where workers knead dough in batches far larger than any household could manage. Huge ovens line the walls, glowing with intense heat. Bread is shaped quickly, efficiently, repeatedly. The process is no longer individual. It is systematic. Flour now comes from industrial mills that produce finely ground, uniform flour in massive quantities. This creates more consistent bread than ever before. Dough behaves more predictably. Baking becomes more standardized. For many people, this meant reliable daily food at lower cost. But it also meant a loss of individuality in some traditional methods. The unique textures and variations of handmade bread began to be replaced, in many places, by uniform loaves designed for efficiency. Still, bread remained essential, even in industrial cities filled with smoke, machinery, and crowded streets. Bread was still the foundation of working-class life. Factory workers relied on it for energy. Families depended on it for affordability. Markets were filled with loaves of all shapes and sizes, reflecting both tradition and new industrial production. At the same time, science was finally beginning to explain what bakers had known for centuries. The mystery of fermentation slowly came into focus. In the 19th century, scientists began to understand that tiny living organisms, yeast, were responsible for making dough rise. This was a major breakthrough. What bakers had observed for generations was now being explained through biology and chemistry. Yeast consumed sugars in dough and released gases. Those gases formed bubbles. Those bubbles made bread rise. Something once felt as mysterious as magic was now understood as natural process. But this scientific understanding did not replace traditional baking knowledge. Instead, it refined it. bakers could now control fermentation more precisely. Yeast could be cultivated more reliably. Bread production became more predictable at scale. This combination of science and industry transformed bread once again. In cities, bakeries often worked through the night. Bread had to be ready by morning. Workers arrived in dark hours, mixing dough, shaping loaves, managing ovens. The rhythm of baking was no longer tied only to sunrise and household needs. It was tied to urban schedules. Bread became part of city infrastructure. And yet, even in this industrial age, something emotional remained unchanged. The smell of fresh bread still meant comfort. A warm loaf still meant care. A shared meal still meant connection. No matter how large the bakery or how advanced the machinery, bread still carried the same meaning it always had: nourishment, survival, and belonging. But industrialization also brought challenges. Working conditions in early factories and bakeries were often harsh. Long hours, intense heat, repetitive labor, and lack of regulation affected workers. Bread became cheap and widely available, but the human effort behind it was often invisible to those who consumed it. And this invisibility was new. In ancient times, people saw the entire process, from grain to bread, in their homes or villages. In industrial cities, production became separated from consumption. Bread arrived at shops already made. The connection between food and its origin began to fade for many urban consumers. This shift changed human awareness of food, but it also made bread more accessible than ever before. Meanwhile, transportation networks expanded. Railways began carrying grain and flour across regions quickly. Cities could be supplied from distant farmlands. Bread production became a national system rather than purely local. The world of bread was becoming interconnected at a scale never seen before. And as the 19th century moved forward, even more innovations began to appear. Improved ovens, better temperature control, refined yeast cultures, and early forms of packaged baking ingredients started to emerge. Bread was entering a new phase of consistency and control. But beneath all these changes, the same ancient foundations still held. Grain from the earth, water mixed by hand or machine, heat from fire or steam, time shaping transformation, and the human need for food that fills not just the stomach, but also provides comfort and continuity. As industrial cities grew louder, faster, and more complex, bread remained one of the few constants that connected people to centuries of history. And yet, another transformation was approaching, because in the next era, bread would face the challenges of modern global systems, mass production on an even larger scale, and new questions about quality, nutrition, and tradition in a rapidly changing world. And so the story continues forward into the modern age, where bread becomes both a global commodity and a symbol of cultural identity across the world. The world had entered the modern age, and bread now lived in a reality far removed from the quiet villages of the past. Cities were larger than ever before. Factories stretched across industrial zones. Railways cut through landscapes like steel rivers. Steam, electricity, and machines had changed how humans lived, worked, and ate. And bread, ancient, simple bread, had to survive inside this new world. At first, the industrial systems of bread production continued to expand. Mills became faster and more efficient. Flour could be produced in enormous quantities and transported over long distances. Bread was no longer something made only in local communities. It was now part of national and even international supply chains. Imagine a modern early 20th century city morning. The sky is gray with smoke. Streets are filled with workers heading toward factories, offices, and shops. Horse carts and early motor vehicles move through crowded roads. Newspaper boys shout headlines, and everywhere bakeries open their doors. The smell of fresh bread spreads through the air. For many people, this smell is one of the most comforting signals of daily life. It means food is available. It means the day has begun. It means survival is steady, even in a fast-changing world. But behind this comforting image, bread production had become highly organized. Large commercial bakeries now dominated urban food supply in many places. Machines mixed dough in large vats. Conveyor systems helped shape and move loaves. Ovens were designed for continuous baking. Bread could be produced in thousands of units per day. This was no longer craft alone. It was industry at full scale. And with this scale came standardization. In earlier centuries, bread varied widely from village to village, baker to baker. But in modern industrial production, consistency became a priority. People expected the same texture, the same size, the same taste every time they bought a loaf. Uniform flour, controlled yeast, measured ingredients, and precise baking times made this possible. Bread became predictable, and predictability became valuable in a world where everything else was changing rapidly. But this shift also introduced a quiet tension. Many traditional bakers and communities felt something was being lost. The personal touch of handmade bread, the subtle differences in texture and flavor, the deep connection between local grain, local water, and local hands. Bread was becoming less local, more global, more industrial. At the same time, scientific understanding of bread deepened even further. The role of yeast was now fully recognized. Scientists and bakers began cultivating specific strains for consistency and speed. This allowed dough to rise more reliably and faster than ever before. Bread production became not just an art of patience, but also a controlled biological process. Fermentation, once mysterious, became manageable, but even as science advanced, bread still depended on something ancient: time. No machine could completely remove the waiting. Dough still needed rest. Flavor still developed slowly. Even in the fastest factories, bread required moments of transformation that could not be rushed. Meanwhile, global trade expanded dramatically in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Grain moved across continents on steamships and trains. Wheat from one hemisphere could be milled in another and baked in a third. Bread had become part of a truly global network. This global system brought both abundance and vulnerability. On one hand, many cities had more reliable access to bread than ever before in history. On the other hand, dependence on distant supply chains meant that disruptions, wars, droughts, economic crises could affect bread availability on massive scales, and history would soon show how critical this was. During major global conflicts in the 20th century, bread became a central concern for governments and populations. Wartime rationing systems controlled flour distribution. Bread quality and quantity were carefully managed to ensure survival under stress. In some places, recipes were altered to stretch ingredients further. Different grains or substitutes were added to conserve wheat. Bread became a symbol of endurance during difficult times. A simple loaf could represent stability in chaos. At the same time, technological innovation continued. Automatic slicers began to appear in bakeries. Packaging improved. Bread could now be wrapped, preserved, and transported more efficiently than ever before. This made it easier for people in cities and towns to access fresh bread consistently. By the early to mid-20th century, a new idea began to spread in some regions: pre-sliced bread. It may sound simple today, but at the time it was revolutionary. For the first time, bread was not just baked and sold. It was also prepared for immediate convenience. This small change reshaped household routines, saving time and making bread even more integrated into fast-paced modern life. Bread was adapting again, but alongside convenience came new debates. Nutritionists, scientists, and consumers began discussing the differences between industrial bread and traditional methods. Questions arose about processing, additives, freshness, and health. People started to reflect more deeply on what they were eating and how it was made. Bread was no longer just a background necessity. It was becoming a subject of public conversation, and in many homes, bread still held emotional meaning that technology could not replace. A child returning from school still reached for a sandwich made with soft slices. A family still shared meals around the table where bread was present in some form. A traveler still carried bread as a reminder of home. Even in a world of machines and global systems, bread remained deeply human. But something else was also happening quietly. In response to industrial standardization, small movements began to preserve traditional baking methods. Artisan bakeries kept old techniques alive: long fermentation, natural starters, stone ovens, handmade shaping. These bakers valued flavor, texture, and history over speed and uniformity. Bread was splitting into two worlds: mass production for efficiency, artisan baking for tradition, and both would continue side by side. By the mid-20th century, bread had fully entered the modern consumer world. Supermarkets, packaged goods, branding, advertising, all began to shape how people saw bread. It was no longer only something made nearby. It was something bought, selected, and compared. Different brands promised softness, freshness, nutrition, or convenience. Bread had become both product and identity. Yet, despite all this transformation, something essential never changed. Every loaf still began the same way it always had: grain transformed by human effort, water binding it together, heat turning it into food, and time quietly shaping everything in between. As the modern world continued to accelerate, bread remained one of the most constant elements of daily life, present in breakfast tables, school lunches, street markets, and family kitchens across the globe. But even this modern stability would not remain unchanged forever, because in the next part, bread would enter a new era of globalization, biotechnology, and cultural revival, where ancient methods and cutting-edge science begin to merge, and humanity starts to rediscover the deeper meaning behind its oldest food. The modern world was moving faster than ever before. Airplanes crossed oceans in hours instead of weeks. Computers began to connect people across continents. Cities grew upward into skylines of glass and steel. Life was no longer shaped only by seasons and harvests, but by schedules, systems, and global networks. And yet, in the middle of all this speed, bread remained, still present, still essential, still ancient at its core. But now, bread had entered a new kind of world, one where tradition and technology were no longer separate paths, but often intertwined in unexpected ways. Walk into a modern city supermarket: bright lights, clean floors, shelves stretching in endless rows. And there, in the bakery section, is bread in every form imaginable: white bread, whole grain bread, multi-grain, seeded loaves, gluten-free versions, organic options, enriched varieties, artisan-style imitations, and packaged slices designed for convenience. Bread is no longer one thing. It is many things at once, and each version reflects a different demand of modern life: health, speed, taste, price, identity, culture. But behind these shelves lies a global system far more complex than any earlier civilization could have imagined. Wheat is grown in vast agricultural regions across continents, harvested by massive machines that cut and collect grain in hours, transported in trucks and ships across countries and oceans, milled in industrial facilities that can process enormous quantities of flour with precision and consistency, distributed through networks that reach millions of people daily. Bread is now the product of global coordination. A single loaf may represent work from farmers in one region, millers in another, transport workers across several countries, and bakers in large automated facilities. The simplicity of bread hides an extraordinary complexity. But alongside this industrial system, something very important began to rise again in recent decades. A return to tradition. In many parts of the world, people started to question heavily processed food systems. They began looking back at older methods of baking, long fermentation, natural sourdough starters, stone-ground flour, small-scale bakeries, local grains. The artisan bread movement began to grow. Imagine a small modern bakery on a quiet street. The smell of fresh bread drifts out through an open door. Inside, flour dust floats in warm light. Wooden tables hold dough resting slowly in baskets. A baker checks fermentation by touch, not just by timer. Ovens are smaller, more controlled, often resembling older styles. Here, bread is not rushed. It is respected. Sourdough bread, in particular, became a symbol of this revival. Unlike industrial bread that relies on fast-acting yeast, sourdough uses natural fermentation, capturing wild yeast and bacteria from the environment and cultivating them in a living starter. This connects modern bakers directly to ancient practices. The same invisible forces that once made dough rise thousands of years ago in early villages are still at work today. Only now they are better understood, carefully maintained, and intentionally guided. Science and tradition are no longer enemies. They are partners. At the same time, nutrition science has reshaped how people think about bread. Studies on fiber, whole grains, digestion, and health have influenced modern baking. Some breads are designed for energy release, others for dietary needs, others for specific lifestyles. Bread has become personalized. In ancient times, bread was survival. In industrial times, bread was efficiency. In the modern age, bread is choice. But even with all this variety, bread still carries emotional weight that technology cannot replace. Think about a family table in the evening. A loaf is placed in the center. Hands reach for slices. Conversations happen over simple meals. The bread is not just food, it is shared experience. A quiet link between people, even in busy modern life. Bread still marks connection. And in many cultures, bread remains deeply symbolic. It is still present in celebrations, religious rituals, festivals, and everyday gestures of hospitality. Offering bread still means offering care. But the modern world has also created new challenges. Large-scale production can sometimes prioritize shelf life over freshness. Additives may be used to preserve texture. Transportation distances can affect quality, and debates continue about processed versus natural foods, industrial efficiency versus traditional methods. These discussions reflect something deeper. People are still trying to understand what bread should mean in a modern world. Is it simply fuel? Is it culture? Is it health? Is it heritage? The answer, as always, is all of these at once. Meanwhile, technology continues to evolve. Automated bakeries, precision fermentation, and even experimental food science are exploring new ways to produce bread more efficiently and sustainably. Some researchers study alternative grains, climate-resistant crops, and new fermentation techniques to ensure future food security. Because bread is not just history, it is future necessity. Climate change, population growth, and resource limitations are pushing humanity to rethink agriculture and food production. Wheat remains one of the most important crops in the world. Its cultivation, processing, and distribution will continue to shape global stability. Bread, in this sense, is still at the center of human survival. But perhaps the most interesting thing about modern bread is this. Even after thousands of years of transformation, it still connects us to the same ancient moment. A handful of grain, a simple mix with water, a change through heat, and the quiet miracle of something becoming more than its parts. Whether made in a stone oven in a small village or in a massive industrial facility supplying millions, bread still carries the memory of its origin. And that memory is shared across all cultures. As people travel more than ever before, they carry bread traditions with them. Recipes migrate across borders. Fusion cuisines appear. New flavors emerge. Yet beneath all variations, the idea remains recognizable. Bread is universal, and universality is rare. It means that across time, geography, language, and culture, humans found something that speaks to all of them in a similar way. Comfort, sustenance, belonging. And so, even in a hypermodern world of artificial intelligence, digital systems, and global complexity, bread continues to sit quietly at the center of human life, unchanged in its essence, even as everything around it evolves. But the story is still not finished. In the end, bread is not just food. It is memory. It is history that can be held in the hands, broken into pieces, shared between people who may not even speak the same language, yet still understand what it means. Because bread has been there from the very beginning of human civilization, long before cities, long before writing, long before the world looked anything like it does today. It began with hunger, not a simple hunger, but a deep ancient need that shaped the behavior of early humans, a need that pushed them to search the earth, to learn the patterns of nature, to gather what could be stored, and to experiment with fire, stone, and grain, from crushed wild seeds near a fire to the first flat cakes cooked on hot stones, to the discovery of fermentation and rising dough. Bread slowly became something more than survival. It became creation. And creation always changes the creator. Across thousands of years, bread shaped human life in ways people rarely notice when they sit at a table. It influenced where settlements formed because grain needed land and water. It encouraged stability because farming required staying in one place. It supported population growth because stored grain could feed many more people than hunting alone. Bread helped build villages. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. And cities became civilizations. Even great empires depended on it. Not gold, not jewels, not monuments. Bread, the simple cycle of grain, water, heat, and time, quietly supported everything else humanity built on top of it. And yet, bread is also deeply personal. Think of a child tearing into warm bread for the first time. The softness inside, the warmth still trapped in the crust, the smell that feels safe even without explanation. Think of a worker returning home after a long day, eating a simple slice of bread that feels like relief more than food. Think of families gathering around a table where bread is shared without hesitation, passed from hand to hand as a quiet act of connection. Bread is one of the few foods that carries both survival and emotion at the same time. It feeds the body, but it also feeds something less visible, the sense of being grounded in life, in community, in continuity. Across cultures, bread takes different forms. Flat, round, thick, soft, crusty, steamed, baked, fermented, enriched, or simple. It adapts endlessly. It reflects climate, soil, culture, and history. Yet no matter how different it becomes, it always remains recognizable as bread. That is what makes it extraordinary. Few human inventions survive in so many forms for so long, across so many civilizations, without losing their identity. Bread has survived because it is not just a recipe. It is a process, and that process is deeply tied to nature itself. Grain grows from soil shaped by rain and sun. Yeast lives in the air and on surfaces all around us. Fire transforms raw ingredients into something stable and nourishing. Even time plays a role, allowing fermentation to develop flavor and structure. Bread is nature and human effort working together. It is cooperation between the earth and human hands. As centuries passed, humans began to understand more about what they were doing. Science revealed the invisible world inside dough. Microorganisms explained fermentation. Chemistry explained heat transformation. Agriculture improved grain yields. Technology improved milling and baking efficiency. But even with all this knowledge, bread never lost its mystery. Because knowing how something works does not erase the wonder of it. A simple mixture still becomes something completely different after heat. Soft dough still transforms into structured food. Time still shapes flavor in ways no machine can fully replace. That transformation still feels remarkable, even today. In modern life, bread exists in many forms at once. It is industrial and artisanal, global and local, fast and slow, packaged and freshly baked. It exists in supermarkets, street stalls, bakeries, and home kitchens. It travels through global supply chains and also through simple family traditions passed down quietly. And in every form, it still carries its original purpose to sustain life, but also something more subtle, to connect life. Because bread is always shared, it is rarely eaten alone in meaning, even when eaten alone physically. It implies farming, harvesting, milling, baking, and human effort across time and space. It implies community, even when that community is invisible. When someone eats bread, they are never truly disconnected from others, from farmers in fields, from bakers in ovens, from ancient humans who first learned to grind grain beside firelight. Bread is a bridge across time, a silent reminder that human beings have always depended on the same simple foundations: earth, water, fire, and cooperation. And perhaps that is why bread feels so universal. It does not belong to one culture, one nation, or one moment in history. It belongs to humanity, from the first wild grains gathered in prehistoric landscapes to the great bread systems of ancient empires, to medieval ovens in stone villages, to industrial bakeries in crowded cities, to modern kitchens across the world. The story of bread is the story of us. And even now, as technology continues to evolve and the world moves toward an uncertain future, bread remains. Still baked, still shared, still essential. A reminder that no matter how far humanity advances, we still return to the same simple truth that started it all. We are beings who turn grain into life and share that life with each other. Even after thousands of years of change, bread never stopped evolving. It simply kept adapting quietly, steadily shifting with every new human discovery, every new culture, every new demand of survival and comfort. But in the modern world, something new was happening again. Not just change in how bread was made, but change in how people thought about bread. For the first time in human history, bread was no longer just something that happened in the background of life. It had become something people actively questioned, studied, criticized, and reinvented. In laboratories, scientists examined flour under microscopes. They studied gluten networks, starch behavior, fermentation patterns, and enzyme reactions. What ancient bakers once understood through touch and intuition was now being mapped, measured, and explained in precise detail. In bakeries, technology advanced even further. Temperature-controlled ovens replaced wood-fired unpredictability in many places. Automated mixers replicated hours of hand kneading in minutes. Industrial yeast production allowed consistent fermentation at massive scale. Packaging technology extended shelf life far beyond what earlier generations could imagine. Bread was entering a new scientific industrial identity. But at the same time, something emotional was stirring in the opposite direction. People began to feel disconnected from food. In fast-paced cities, bread often arrived wrapped in plastic, uniform, identical, and far removed from the fields where grain was grown or the hands that once shaped it. Meals became quicker. Cooking became optional. Food became convenience. And in that convenience, something subtle was lost. Not nutrition, but connection. So a quiet shift began. People started asking questions that had not been common for a long time. Where does my bread come from? How is it made? What is inside it? Is faster always better? These questions gave rise to a new movement, one that looked backward in time to move forward again. The revival of traditional baking. Imagine a small bakery in a modern neighborhood. It does not look like a factory. There are no loud machines, no conveyor belts. Instead, there are wooden shelves, cloth-covered dough baskets, and a slow rhythm that feels almost ancient. A baker stands early in the morning, preparing a sourdough starter that has been alive for years, sometimes even decades. It is fed daily with flour and water, carefully maintained like a living companion. This starter is not just an ingredient. It is history in motion. When mixed into dough, it brings fermentation that takes hours, sometimes a full day or more. The bread rises slowly, shaped by natural processes rather than industrial speed. The result is often deeper in flavor, more complex in texture, and less predictable, but more alive. This return to slow bread making is not about rejecting modern science. It is about combining understanding with tradition. Because now bakers know why fermentation works. They understand yeast, bacteria, enzymes, hydration, gluten structure, but they also respect the old rhythm of time, patience, and observation that ancient bakers depended on. This is where bread enters a new identity, not ancient, not purely industrial, but hybrid. At the same time, global culture continues to influence bread in new ways. Migration, travel, and digital communication have allowed recipes to spread faster than ever before. A sourdough technique from one continent can inspire bakers on another. Flatbreads, rolls, artisan loaves, stuffed breads, sweetbreads, everything mixes, adapts, and evolves. Bread becomes a global conversation. Walk through any international city today, and you will see this clearly. Bakeries offering French-style baguettes next to Middle Eastern flatbreads, South Asian naan, American sandwich loaves, Italian focaccia, and experimental fusion creations that blend traditions in unexpected ways. Bread is no longer confined by geography. It travels with people. It carries identity. And it shares identity. But even in this diversity, something remains constant. The basic act of bread making has not changed. Grain still must be grown. Flour still must be produced. Dough still must be formed. Heat still must transform it. That core transformation, the miracle of something simple becoming something sustaining, remains untouched by time. Meanwhile, new scientific fields continue to explore bread in surprising ways. Nutrition science studies how different grains affect the body. Food technology experiments with gluten alternatives, fermentation optimization, and sustainable agriculture. Climate research examines how changing weather patterns affect wheat production worldwide. Because bread is not just culture, it is also survival infrastructure. The stability of global food systems depends heavily on grains like wheat. Any disruption, climate change, economic instability, or supply chain breakdown can have massive effects. Bread, once a simple village food, is now tied to global resilience. And yet, despite all this complexity, bread still appears in the simplest human moments. A sandwich packed for school, a piece shared between friends, a loaf broken during a family meal, a warm slice eaten alone in quiet reflection. In these moments, bread loses its global complexity and becomes personal again. It becomes what it always was: comfort, sustenance, presence. There is something deeply human about that continuity. Across every era, prehistoric camps, ancient fields, Roman cities, medieval villages, industrial factories, modern bakeries, bread has never stopped being part of daily life. It has changed shape, scale, meaning, and method, but it has never disappeared. And perhaps that is what makes its story so powerful. Because bread is not just about food. It is about how humans learn to survive together. It is about how we transform nature into nourishment. It is about how knowledge passes from generation to generation without ever needing to be fully written down. It is about patience, repetition, and shared effort. And as the modern world continues to evolve toward automation, artificial intelligence, new agriculture systems, and unknown future challenges, bread will likely continue to evolve too, but it will carry with it everything it has always carried: the memory of firelit stones, the rhythm of ancient hands grinding grain, the rise of dough in quiet kitchens, the smell of baking that has comforted humans for thousands of years. In the present age, bread exists in a world that would be almost unrecognizable to the earliest humans who first crushed wild grains beside a fire. Today, bread is everywhere. It is in supermarkets under bright fluorescent lights. It is in small neighborhood bakeries where the smell spills into the street. It is in cafes, restaurants, street stalls, airports, hotels, school cafeterias, and home kitchens across every continent. And yet, despite this overwhelming presence, most people rarely stop to think about how deeply ancient this food truly is. Bread feels ordinary now, but it is not ordinary at all. It is one of the oldest continuous technologies of human civilization. To understand modern bread, you have to imagine the entire chain that brings it into existence today. It begins in vast agricultural fields that stretch across countries. Modern wheat farming is highly mechanized. Massive tractors prepare soil. Seed drills plant in long, precise rows. Irrigation systems deliver controlled water. Fertilizers and agricultural science improve yield and resistance to disease. Months later, harvesters move across golden fields, cutting and collecting grain in hours that once would have taken entire communities weeks to complete. From there, grain enters a global system. It is transported by trucks, trains, and ships. It passes through storage silos that can hold enormous quantities. It is tested for quality, moisture, and consistency. Then it is sent to industrial mills, where it is cleaned, sorted, and ground into flour with incredible precision. What once took a single stone and human effort now happens in highly controlled environments designed for efficiency and scale. This flour is then delivered to bakeries, some massive industrial facilities producing thousands or even millions of loaves a day, and others small artisan shops where individual bakers still shape each loaf by hand. Modern bread production exists in two parallel worlds. One is driven by speed, scale, and consistency. The other is driven by tradition, craft, and flavor. Both serve the same fundamental purpose, feeding people. But they reflect different values of modern life. In industrial baking facilities, precision is everything. Machines measure ingredients down to exact weights. Dough mixers replicate perfect kneading cycles. Fermentation is carefully timed. Ovens are engineered for uniform heat distribution. Conveyor systems move bread efficiently from one stage to the next. The goal is reliability. Every loaf must be predictable. In contrast, artisan bakeries embrace variation. They work with natural fermentation, often using sourdough starters that contain wild yeast and bacteria from the environment. These starters can be decades old, passed from baker to baker like living heritage. In these spaces, time is not rushed. Dough is allowed to rest. Flavor develops slowly. The baker observes rather than controls every detail. And between these two systems, industrial and artisan modern bread culture finds its balance. But beyond production methods, bread today is also deeply connected to identity. In different parts of the world, bread is not just food, it is culture expressed through flavor and form. In South Asia, naan and roti are central to daily meals, cooked on hot surfaces or in clay ovens. In the Middle East, flatbreads like pita accompany almost every dish. In Europe, crusty loaves and sourdoughs are common staples. In Latin America, corn-based breads and tortillas carry ancient traditions forward. In North America, sliced sandwich bread became a symbol of convenience and modern living. Bread adapts to people, and people adapt bread. At the same time, modern nutrition science has transformed how bread is understood. There is ongoing discussion about whole grains versus refined flour, fiber content, gluten sensitivity, and dietary health. Some people seek traditional breads for their simplicity. Others prefer enriched or specialized breads designed for specific dietary needs. Bread is now part of health conversations, not just cultural ones. This reflects a larger shift in human awareness. Food is no longer just consumed. It is analyzed, compared, and personalized. Technology has also entered the home kitchen in new ways. Bread machines allow people to mix, knead, and bake bread automatically. Smart ovens regulate temperature with precision. Online recipes and global cooking videos allow anyone to learn techniques once limited to professional bakers. Bread-making knowledge is more accessible than ever before in history. A person sitting in one part of the world can now learn sourdough techniques from another continent in minutes. The ancient craft has become global knowledge. But even with all this modernization, something deeply emotional remains unchanged. The moment bread is broken still carries meaning. A loaf placed on a table still signals sharing. The smell of baking bread still creates comfort almost universally. These reactions are not learned. They are inherited through thousands of years of human experience. Bread connects modern humans to ancient instincts: safety, warmth, community, survival. Even in highly digital, fast-paced societies, bread remains one of the few foods that still slows people down, even briefly. A fresh loaf invites pause. A shared meal invites conversation. A simple slice invites memory. And in that pause, something ancient quietly returns. You are no longer just in a modern world of machines and systems. You are also connected to every generation that ever shaped dough with their hands. But the story of bread is still not finished, because in the modern age, new challenges are emerging. Climate change is affecting wheat production across the globe. Soil conditions are shifting. Water resources are under pressure. Food security is becoming a central global concern. Scientists are developing new grain varieties, exploring sustainable agriculture, and searching for ways to maintain bread production in a changing environment. At the same time, cultural movements are trying to preserve traditional baking methods before they disappear entirely. So bread today stands at a crossroads between industry and tradition, between global systems and local identity, between speed and patience, between convenience and craft. And in the middle of all this, bread remains exactly what it has always been at its core: a transformation of grain into life, a process that has survived every era of human history, and a reminder that even in the most advanced world, we still depend on the same simple foundations that our earliest ancestors discovered beside a fire thousands of years ago. At the deepest level, the story of bread is not a story about food at all. It is a story about humans learning how to shape the world just enough to survive in it, and then slowly learning how to live well within it. Because bread did not arrive as a finished invention. It was discovered, forgotten, rediscovered, refined, expanded, industrialized, questioned, and reborn again and again across thousands of years. And yet, at every stage, it stayed familiar. That is what makes it extraordinary. If you trace bread back far enough, beyond modern bakeries, beyond ancient cities, beyond farming itself, you arrive at something almost invisible in time. A moment where early humans first noticed that seeds could be eaten. Then that seeds could be stored. Then that seeds could be crushed. Then that crushed seeds mixed with water could become something new. And then, through fire, something even more powerful happened. Transformation. That is the real origin of bread. Not a recipe, not a place, but a discovery that nature could be changed through human action into something more useful, more stable, more shareable. From that moment onward, bread began to travel alongside humanity itself. It walked with us out of prehistoric landscapes into settled fields. It grew with us into villages, then cities. It fed empires, sustained armies, built trade routes, and supported entire civilizations. It crossed oceans on ships, entered factories during industrialization, and now exists in a global system of production and culture that spans the entire planet. But no matter how far it has traveled, bread has always returned to the same simple truth. It is made from the earth, for the body, and shared between people. In every era, bread reflects the world that makes it. In ancient times, it reflected survival. In medieval times, it reflected community and risk. In industrial times, it reflected efficiency and scale. In the modern world, it reflects globalization, choice, and identity. And in every form, it still carries something deeper than economics or technology. It carries memory, not just personal memory, but collective memory. When someone eats bread today, they are participating in a ritual that is older than writing, older than cities, older than most of recorded human history. Without realizing it, they are repeating an action that connects them to countless generations who did the same. Break grain, mix water, use heat, wait for transformation, eat live, survive. And because of that, bread becomes more than nourishment. It becomes a silent link between humans across time. A farmer in ancient Mesopotamia, a baker in medieval Europe, a worker in an industrial city, a modern student in a busy apartment, all connected through the same basic food, all part of the same continuous story. Even the way bread is shared holds meaning that has not changed. Breaking bread at a table is still one of the simplest human acts of trust and connection. It is a gesture that says, "You are safe here, you are welcome here, you are not alone here." In a world that is often fast, divided, and uncertain, that gesture still matters. Perhaps that is why bread has never disappeared, even as other ancient foods faded or changed beyond recognition. Because bread is not just about taste. It is about continuity. It is about the human need to turn uncertainty into something stable. It is about taking something fragile grain and transforming it through effort, knowledge, and time into something that can sustain life. And in that transformation, there is a reflection of humanity itself. We are, in many ways, the same as bread. We are shaped by environment. We are changed by time. We are refined by experience. We are strengthened by pressure and heat. And we are always becoming something slightly more than what we were before. So when we look at bread across its long journey from wild grasses to global supply chains, we are really looking at ourselves, at our progress, at our survival, at our creativity, at our need to share, and at our ability to take something simple and make it meaningful across thousands of years. In the end, bread is not just history. It is proof that even the smallest discoveries can reshape the world. Proof that survival can become culture. Proof that repetition can become tradition. And proof that humanity has always been connected, not by empires or technology, but by the most ordinary, extraordinary act of all, turning grain into life and sharing that life with each other.